What if the greatest story ever told wasn't told completely? What if the cross, as central as it is to Christian belief, wasn't the final chapter but just a misunderstood one? For centuries, millions have envisioned the crucifixion of Jesus Christ as the ultimate act of sacrifice, a moment that split history and redefined eternity. But behind the veil of scripture, relics, and tradition, a quieter possibility whispers from the shadows. A theory that suggests Jesus may not have died on the cross at all, but survived it and walked away from Golgotha with lungs full of breath and a mission yet unfinished. The canonical Gospels describe a swift death. Jesus is nailed, raised, and within a few hours declared dead. Roman soldiers trained in the art of execution confirm his demise. A spear is thrust into his side, blood and water flow. He's removed and buried quickly before the Sabbath begins. But here lies the first mystery. Crucifixion was designed to be a slow, excruciating process that could last days. Victims were meant to suffer, publicly, humiliatingly. Why did Jesus die so quickly? Pontius Pilate himself expressed surprise at how soon the end had come. It was uncommon, even suspicious. Add to that the use of myrrh and aloes, recorded in the Gospel of John as being part of the burial mixture, while often considered part of Jewish burial custom. These substances were also used in ancient medicine, known for their healing properties. Why anoint a corpse with healing agent? Unless, of course, the one being wrapped wasn't truly dead. Could the burial have been a form of emergency? Medical treatment, concealed, under the pretense of ritual? The Gospels note that Jesus was offered a drink of vinegar, mixed with gall or myrrh, just before he gave up his spirit. Some scholars suggest that this mixture may have had narcotic effects, potentially rendering him unconscious, appearing lifeless to observers. Was it truly the last breath, or just a temporary collapse into silence? Then comes the resurrection. According to the Christian faith, Jesus rose bodily from the dead on the third day, showing his wounds to his disciples, yet appearing and disappearing at will, seemingly unbound by physical limitation. But what if this appearance wasn't supernatural in the way we've long believed, but natural in a different sense? What if he never truly died, and the resurrection was, instead, a carefully executed recovery? Early Gnostic texts, rejected from the biblical canon, support the idea of a Christ who was never crucified in the first place. In the second treatise of the Great Seth, Jesus is quoted as saying, "I did not die in reality, but in appearance." Such writings were deemed heretical, but they offer a compelling counter-narrative, a whisper of dissent that has never fully faded. And then there's the Quran, which states unequivocally that Jesus was not crucified, nor killed, but it was made to appear so. In Islamic tradition, God saved Jesus, lifting him to the heavens, while another, possibly Judas, was made to look like him and crucified in his place. While this view diverges sharply from Christian doctrine, it contributes to a shared uncertainty. The events of that day may not be as linear or final as we've been taught. But if Jesus survived, where did he go? Here the theories multiply and the trail turns eastward, toward Persia, India, and even Kashmir. In the remote valley of Srinagar, there exists a tomb known as the Rosabal Shrine. Local tradition claims it is the final resting place of a prophet named Uz Asaf, who arrived from the West with deep knowledge of Jewish law, performed miracles, and taught love and compassion until his death at an old age. His teachings echo the voice of Jesus. Could this Uz Asaf be the historical Jesus, living out his days far from Rome's reach and the world's expectations? Ancient documents found in Ladakh and Tibet refer to a holy man from Israel who studied and taught among the Buddhists, rejecting violence and embracing deep meditation. His life overlaps eerily with the silent 18 years of Jesus' life not recorded in the Gospels. Those mysterious missing years between childhood and ministry. Could it be that Jesus not only survived the cross but returned to lands he had already known, to continue a mission not of conquest but of spiritual unity? Skeptics ask, why would such a truth be hidden? The answer may lie in power. A risen divine Christ fit the theological needs of a church seeking authority. mystery and salvation through sacrifice. A Christ who lived, fled, and taught in exile would have been too human, too vulnerable, too threatening to the structured faith that would rise in his name. Survival undermines martyrdom. It complicates redemption. But history is often written not by truth, but by need. Consider also the secretive behavior of early Christians, their use of symbols, fish signs, and coded messages. Were they hiding only from Roman persecution, or also preserving alternative versions of the story, ones too volatile to share openly? Over time, the narrative may have been streamlined, simplified, canonized, leaving behind traces of a more complex reality in apocryphal texts, oral traditions, and legends too wild to fit neatly into a creed. There are peculiarities in the post-resurrection appearances, too. Mary Magdalene does not recognize him immediately. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walk with him for hours before their eyes are opened. Thomas doubts and needs to touch wounds. Could this strangeness be because Jesus had physically survived? Changed by the ordeal, scarred but not spectrally risen? The Gospel of Mark originally ended abruptly, with an empty tomb and frightened women saying nothing. Later editions softened the uncertainty. Perhaps silence was closer to truth. If Jesus lived beyond the cross, his message takes on new layers. He becomes not just a sacrifice, but a model of survival, one who endured horror, forgave his enemies, escaped death, and walked forward anyway. His teachings become not just the words of a dying man, but of one who chose life again and again, even in the face of unimaginable betrayal. The image of Jesus walking out of the tomb under his own power, aching, breathing, trembling, is strangely more human and perhaps more powerful than any miracle. It suggests that hope does not require magic, but resilience. That love is not proven by dying, but by refusing to give hate the final word. Whether myth or memory, metaphor or reality, the idea that Jesus did not die on the cross reshapes everything. It challenges institutions, reopens ancient questions, and invites us to see with new eyes. It doesn't diminish faith. It deepens it. For if he walked away from death, not as a God pretending to be man, but as a man embodying the divine, then his triumph is not just over death, but over fear, deception, and the limits of human belief. And maybe that's the most revolutionary idea of all, that the true miracle wasn't in the dying, but in the surviving. That the real resurrection wasn't a return from the dead, but the quiet continuation of a life too, vast for any tomb to hold. So what would it mean if Jesus had lived on, not in spirit, not in myth, but in flesh and bone, walking, teaching, healing? It would mean that the cross, instead of being the final altar of sacrifice, becomes a symbol of endurance, of confronting violence and walking through it. It would mean that his message of peace did not end in bloodshed, but was carried quietly into the world like a flame, hidden beneath the folds of time, passed from hand to trembling hand across continents and generations. The implications are enormous, and they echo across religious traditions. A Jesus who lived would challenge the established concepts of salvation, no longer centered on death, but on transformation, no longer confined to a moment of execution, but spread across the long arc of a life lived in defiance of fear, hatred, and imperial control. This Jesus would not merely be a divine being sent to die, but a revolutionary teacher who survived, persisted, and continued to challenge the systems of oppression through nonviolence and love. There are whispers in the ancient hills of Kashmir that he walked among them. Local traditions describe a man who arrived from the West, who bore wounds on his hands and feet, who spoke of a distant land and a divine mission. He taught in parables, healed the sick, and preached unity. He died not in agony on a hill, but in peace, surrounded by students who never quite knew the weight of the man who stood before them. In Rosabal, candles still burn before a stone tomb. Its guardians speak little, but the legend remains. In the writings of early travelers, Persians, Greeks, Buddhists, appear brief glimpses of a sage from the land of Israel, whose words mirrored those of Christ. Not copied, not stolen, but shared, as if they had originated from the same source. This suggests not mere coincidence, but presence. Echoes of Jesus outside Judea, outside the narrative. If we trace these lines backward, through time and terrain, we find not a broken Messiah, but a walking truth. One who passed through death's shadow and kept going. He may have blended into the mountains, changed his name, his language, even his appearance, but his essence, that could never be hidden. His compassion, his refusal to condemn, his deep gaze that saw through hypocrisy, these things linger wherever he went. Even within the Gospels themselves, contradictions emerge. Did he ascend immediately, or did he remain for 40 days? Did he show himself to many, or only a few? Was his body tangible or transfigured? These aren't mistakes, they're invitations. Invitations to look deeper, to question, to wonder if perhaps what's true lies not in the surface story, but beneath it. In the centuries following his disappearance, many movements arose. Mystics in the desert spoke of a man of light. Sufis in Persia chanted of a master who transcended flesh. Buddhist scrolls whispered of a prophet from the West. Could they all be describing the same figure? Could the story of Jesus be so vast, so human, that it seeped into cultures never touched by Roman sandals or Christian creeds? Some argue that the mystery is the point, that faith requires silence where answers end. But silence isn't the absence of truth. It's often the birthplace of it. Perhaps those who protected the secret of Jesus' survival weren't liars, but guardians of something too powerful for empire and institution to control. Perhaps they knew that truth wrapped in myth survives longer than facts laid bare. We often picture Jesus as fragile on the cross, broken and bowed, whispering forgiveness. But imagine instead the next image. A man rising slowly from stone, breath rattling in his chest, wounds crusted over. The pain real but distant now. He steps into the early morning light, the tomb behind him. Not flying, not glowing, just walking, alive. There is a sacred power in survival. To endure injustice without letting it define you. To carry the scars but not the bitterness. To face death and walk away, not in defiance but in purpose. If Jesus did that, then he offered us not just redemption through belief, but liberation through resilience. His teachings were always less about theology and more about transformation. He didn't build churches or write creeds. He touched the untouchables. He washed feet. He welcomed children. He walked among the sick and outcast. A man like that, who lived in radical love, would not seek glory in death but meaning in living. A message so simple it shook kingdoms. And perhaps that's why his survival matters. Because it tells us that we too can survive the crosses of our lives. That death is not the only doorway to change. That love doesn't always come in lightning or angels, but in footsteps, in hands outstretched, in breath that refuses to give up. That the greatest story may not be one of sacrifice, but of continuation. If Jesus didn't die that day, then perhaps we're all being invited to a more dangerous, more beautiful faith. One that doesn't hide behind rituals or rely on divine exceptions, but one that follows the example of a man who bore unimaginable suffering and kept walking, who was buried but not broken, forgotten but not gone. And if we listen closely, we might still hear him. Not from the clouds, but from within, the same quiet voice that once said, "Do not be afraid," now whispering across the ages. Not because he left us, but because he never stopped moving forward. Because love doesn't die on crosses. It walks away from them, scarred but alive, searching always for the next soul brave enough to follow.